Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a very special Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is the home of positive populism. As you know, we often talk on this show about political revolutions, but tonight we'll meet someone who's at the forefront of a revolution that's much more personal, a revolution in the way people think and the way they behave. As you can see, we have a great audience right here in the studio. Why? Well, it's in honor of our guest for the hour, Dr. Jordan Peterson. Now, if you're one of the few people who still hasn't heard of Dr. Peterson, his meteoric rise to fame has brought him to the forefront of the world of psychology, with his message influencing millions of people around the world. In fact, Dr. Peterson has been described as the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now. His book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, has become the #1 bestseller on Amazon. For the next hour, Dr. Peterson will share his insights and answer questions from the audience. So let's get right to it. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for joining us all here. We're really excited to see you. This may be quite an annoying question since you've written a book that talks about 12 rules for life. But just for those in our audience who may not have heard your lectures or watched you on YouTube or read the book, is there a way you can capture the essence of your argument? Is there perhaps one rule above all others, or some core argument that you could use to explain?
Well, there's probably two, I would say.
Okay.
One of the rules is do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And that's sort of twinned with tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Right.
And I'd like to concentrate mostly on the rule that describes the necessity of meaning. And I've spent a lot of time talking to my public audiences about this, as well as outlining it in the book. The theme of the book is, in some sense, somewhat pessimistic, because it outlines the reality that we're all ensconced in, let's say, and describes it as one that certainly has an element of tragedy. You know, life is difficult for people, and there's a lot of suffering in life, and it's often contaminated by malevolence, because we can take a bad situation for us and our families and our communities and certainly do everything we can to make it worse. And so there's a dark element to life, and in order to be able to sustain yourself through that properly, you have to find something that's deeply meaningful. And you have an instinct for meaning. I mean, I think you can make a strong case for that neurologically. And the instinct for meaning helps you find a pathway through life that enables you to find engagement, a rich engagement, that can help you thrive in the face of the difficulty of life. And so, and interestingly enough, and this is something that's really struck a chord with my online viewers, I would say, I think the right pathway to meaning is not through rights, and certainly not through impulsive pleasure, but through responsibility.
Right.
Yeah, and so if you think about the people you admire, which is a good way to start thinking about meaning, you know, or even those rare moments when you actually might admire something you yourself have done, it's almost inevitably the case that that's associated with at least taking responsibility for yourself, right? Because no one admires anyone who can't take responsibility for themselves. But you find people increasingly admirable and worthy of imitating and as models for meaning if they can take responsibility for themselves and for their families and for their communities in a way that makes all three of those things work at the same time. And interestingly enough, that kind of provides an antidote. Not only does that rectify suffering itself, because it makes you an effective actor in the world, but it's also an antidote to the trials and tribulations of life. Because, as Nietzsche said, the philosopher, if you have a why, you can bear any how.
I love that line. Let's just say that it's such a great line, and it's one of the ones that really stood out, and it so goes to the heart of your message. Let's just hear it again.
He who has a why can bear any how.
Really, really profound. And your book really shows people how to do exactly that, how to find that why. One of the things that that is a constant theme throughout the book is this concept of order versus chaos. And what's interesting to me is that, as I was saying, and as you mentioned just now, those who hear your message, so many find it a way that they can really change their lives. It's very different,
for the better.
Right? And it's really different from the normal stuff that gets talked about on TV and in politics. You're actually helping people in a direct way. Can you talk a little bit about how this message of take responsibility, find meaning, can help people in all different sort of stations in life, as it were, navigate the chaos and bring order?
Well, first of all, as I laid out in the first part of our discussion, it's necessary to come to terms with the fact that life has a dark element, right? That you're destined for suffering. You're destined to have floods in your life. You're destined to have things fall apart. And you're destined to make mistakes. And so you need to live in a manner that not only makes that acceptable, but that makes it an intelligible part of the game. And the way to do that is to take responsibility for the facts on the ground. Now, if you're taking care of yourself, well, you're a vulnerable person. You can be hurt, and you can do things improperly and badly. And if you're taking care of your family, it's the same thing. And if you're taking care of the community, it's the same thing. There are things in the world that are clearly out of balance that need to be set right. And some of those things are going to bother you and disturb you. And that being bothered by that and having it grate at your conscience or gnaw at your conscience is actually a sign, in some sense, from the deepest parts of your being, that you're being called forward into the world to act responsibly in relationship to those problems and to solve them. It's like you can make the world a less miserable place. You can make yourself a less miserable person and more competent person. You can do things to put your family together, and you can have a broader overarching concern for the family if you can get those first two things straight. And it's see, so often in the last few decades, psychologists and other people who are well-meaning have told everyone, you're okay the way you are. You should feel good about yourself. It's like, I think that's a terrible message for young people, especially young people. It's not a great message for anybody, but it's especially bad for young people because many young people are suffering from, say, a crisis of meaning and purpose. And if you tell them, well, you're okay the way you are, it's like there's no direction for them. What you tell young people is, look, you know, you're young and you're making mistakes and you don't know what you're doing exactly, but there's something to you, man. If you could tap into the potential that lies within you, let's say, if you could take on a noble attitude towards the world and work to rectify suffering and to constrain malevolence, God only knows what you could become. And more importantly than that, that's how our entire society views you. The reason that individual sovereignty inheres in you, why you have the rights of a citizen, and why you're regarded as a sovereign individual, is because our entire culture over thousands of years has actually decided, tens of thousands of years, has actually decided that there's something in you of ultimate value that the entire stability of the entire society depends on, that you could bring forward and nurture, and that the world would definitely be a lesser place without. That's way better than you're okay the way you are.
Right, I think people agree with that. But let's just get specific. So let's just put it in terms that relate a little bit more to our sort of daily political discussions. Let's say, you know, there's issues that people get concerned about, immigration and the economy and jobs and education. What does... I just want to make sure I'm getting this right. You're saying, well, those things are going to be problems. They're probably going to go bad as well as badly as well as go well. But never mind all that. Never mind what happens in Congress or with the presidency, whatever. You can take responsibility for your life right here today by doing what sorts of things?
Well, one of the things that's become somewhat of an internet meme, and people have made all sorts of jokes about this, is that I've suggested, sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, that people stop protesting and start by cleaning up their rooms. And you know, it's not something that's really any different than your mother probably told you endless dozens of times. But the thing is that, especially if you live in a disordered household, it's actually not that easy to put your room in order. First of all, you have to learn to do it. You have to think, well, what am I going to do with my closet? What sort of clothes should be in here? How am I going to present myself to the world? How am I going to be organized so that when I wake up in the morning, I feel like engaging in the day? How do I set up my room so that when I walk in, it's the sort of place that brings out the best in me? How do I put necessary order in this small area, which I have right in front of me? It's like, well, it's good practice to do that. And it's not because a good person keeps the room clean. It's not that. It's because you're setting the stage for the person that you want to be. And this is caught fire to some degree this idea, because I'm taking this simple concept, which is, well, you should clean up your room, and saying, well, no, you don't exactly understand, is that you have a little bit of reality right here in front of you, and it's been granted to you, and you actually have some control over it.
This is what I think is really, I love that, because a lot of your critics, we'll get to some of them later, they describe your message as somewhat dark and
it isn't somewhat dark, it's very dark.
Right, okay, you acknowledge that, but actually what you've just described there is hope. It's hopeful. It's like, okay, the world may be chaotic, but I can do something about my little bit of it.
And it'll make a difference. Well, and there's something
and that's
else.
a positive and hopeful thing. But I'm sorry to cut you. We've got a lot of time, and I just wanted to make sure we had time for a question from our audience, from Chris, I think, who's just here, because I thought it was very relevant to what you were just saying about a lot of what you've been talking about is the individual, take responsibility, and so on. You had an interesting question, Chris, about the individual versus society and the social order. What was your question?
Hello, Dr. Peterson. You recommend that we evolve to become individuals, but aren't we social animals, and don't we derive value from our status in a social context? And hasn't liberalism been the force that has been hyper-focusing on the individual?
Well, we're certainly social creatures. The question is, what level of analysis should be primary? And when I was discussing some of my ideas just moments ago, I made a case for accepting responsibility in an increasingly broad social context. It's like your first job is to get your act together. And that's because you have at least some control over yourself. And you can decide what sort of things you're doing wrong and what sort of things you can do better. And you can work on that. And then you have to do that in a way that's, well, partly of benefit also to your future self. And so the social world starts to creep in there, right? Because the person you're going to be in 5 years is in some sense another person that you have to take into account. So you have to put your life together. But you have to put your life together in a way that works now and next week and next month and next year. And then you have to put it together in a way that's also of benefit to the people who you're intimately associated with. That might be your partner, but it's certainly also your family. And then if you get those things in alignment, in some sort of harmony, and harmony is a good way to think about it, then you can start thinking about how you can do all of that and simultaneously benefit your community. And so if you take full individual responsibility, and which I think is different than concentrating, let's say, on your individual rights, as you take more and more comprehensive individual responsibility, you naturally bring in the entire social world around you, and appropriately. And you should start in a limited domain, because, well, what do you know? You want to start with well, maybe you want to start with experimenting with things where you'd be directly responsible for the negative consequences, for example, if you're trying to change things. And you can practice in these smaller domains, like with regards to your room. If you have your room in order, you could try making it beautiful. That's also extraordinarily difficult, and that'll produce a relationship between you and something transcendent like beauty. You can put yourself together, and in doing so, then you're going to be optimally positioned to be a proper social person. And that's obviously of crucial importance. The question is, what's the initial level of analysis, and where do you start? So.
Great question. I appreciate the answer. It reminds me of something very famous that, in fact, probably the most famous thing that Margaret Thatcher said, and a lot of people misinterpreted it. She perhaps could have not allowed herself to be taken out of context, but she was asked back in the 80s when she was Prime Minister in the UK and there's a big crime problem, well, isn't crime the fault of society? And she just responded instinctively with this very famous phrase, there's no such thing as society. There are just individual men and women and their families, and they are the ones who should take responsibility. She meant that society was formed, that the building blocks are individuals.
Well, she also
I shouldn't have got... I would love to go on all day about that, but I'm afraid we're going to take a break right now. Dr. Jordan Peterson's rapid rise to fame was based around his best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life. But as his public profile grew, many began to view him in a political light. Is that the result of the unique political climate we're seeing under President Trump? Here is Dr. Peterson. We were talking about this earlier, but before we came on air, that you never really thought of yourself as a political author and public figure. But that is how, and as I've been saying, as we've seen, so much of your message is the personal. It's how you, as an individual, can behave and take responsibility. But yet you are being painted in a political light. Do you see yourself as a political figure?
Not particularly, no, but everyone that I'm interviewed by virtually insists that that's what I am.
Right.
Well, but the reason for that is that most of our dialogue in the mainstream media, I would say, is always focused on political issues. And so if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail.
Right.
But it's also the case that part of what brought me to wider public attention was my opposition to some legislation in Canada, a bill called C-16, which I regarded as an attempt on the government's part to compel speech, which, by the way, in the United States, the Supreme Court in the United States in the 1940s decided that it was unconstitutional for the government to ever require you to say certain things.
Right.
There's exceptions for commercial speech. So if you sell tobacco products, for example, you might have to put a label on your packaging. But in private speech, there's to be no compulsion from the government. It's different than forbidding you to say certain things, because this was a requirement for a certain form of speech. And that emerged in this bill, C-16, which purported to do nothing but extend certain rights to the transgender community in Canada, but which was, in my estimation, and I read the policies very carefully, an attempt to write a particular view of gender into the law, the view that gender is only a consequence of environmental conditions, is socially constructed, which is patently false and runs contrary to what I would regard as thoroughly settled science, and also to compel a certain form of address. And I felt that that meant that the politicians in Canada were using a false compassion and a certain ideological attitude to justify extending dominion over the content of free people's speech. And for me, that in combination with the doctrine, the gender social construction doctrine, that was a no-go. I'm not in alignment with either of those. They're wrong. Right. And so I made some videos saying that very clearly, and that pulled me into a political controversy.
And so that resulted in you being described as, or associated with, broadly speaking, the right. Would you put yourself on the right politically, or is that a term you don't even necessarily accept?
Well, one of the things that's happened to me as a consequence of being a social scientist is that I've become more respectful of caution and tradition. And the reason for that is that, and this really is a consequence of being trained properly as a social scientist, what you learn if you're a social scientist who's educated and who's experienced is that things are a lot more complicated than you think they are. And your intervention to make things better probably didn't specify the problem properly and is very unlikely to produce the consequences that you intended. And so the careful social scientists, they have a doctrine which is taught to everyone who's going to be properly trained, which is if you dare to intervene in someone's life or more broadly in public policy, you make the intervention minimal, you control it very carefully, and then you analyze the outcome to see if your intervention worked. Because most of the time, not only will it not work, it will be counterproductive in ways you didn't predict.
That's so different from, I mean, I used to work in government. That is so different from the attitude that is typically there. We've got time for a question. Michael.
Yes. Dr. Peterson, it's a pleasure to see you today.
Thank you.
Dr. Peterson, reading you and hearing you on YouTube, what have you, it seems to be you clearly have an issue with ideologues on both the extreme left and the extreme right. What I call the twin cobras, or the matter and antimatter of our political discourse. So you wrote in your book that our minds are deeply social. And so with that question as a social scientist, are we nurtured to the views that we have grown to have, or are we somehow hardwired by nature to some degree to have a tendency toward one way of thinking or the other? And if we are, if you started to agree with that, if we are predisposed to have some sort of leaning one way or the other, then are we not doomed to a sense of zero-sum warfare for political power? Winners and losers like your friendly lobsters?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is we are tilted by our biological temperament in terms of our political viewpoint. So we know, for example, that conservative people tend to be higher in conscientiousness, a big 5 personality trait, especially in the orderliness element of that trait. And they tend to be lower in another trait, openness. And openness is, broadly speaking, the creativity trait. And so, whereas liberals are high in openness but low in orderliness. And there is very powerful biological tilting towards those temperamental predispositions. Now, they can be moved by experience, but it's as if you have a set point and then you have to strive to move from that set point. Okay, so, and then of course your viewpoints can be modified by your experience and your wisdom, all of that. But you have to start out with a set of filters on the world because the world is too complicated. And so you have to, your mind, your brain, your psyche filters things for you and then presents a certain world to you. So because you can't read all the facts, and some facts jump out at you and others don't, and that's partly a consequence of your temperament. Okay, so that's not necessarily a bad thing because there are different niches for people of different temperaments. So, for example, introverts are good at such things as accounting. They're more because they can work alone, whereas extroverts are better at things like sales. And so there's a place for people on both ends of the temperamental distribution. And with creative people, you might think, well, creativity is a good thing. Why isn't everyone creative? It's like, well, most creative ideas are dangerous, and it's very difficult to monetize creativity. Sometimes if you do it successfully, you're wildly successful, but more often you'll fail. So you need people who are wild experimenters in thinking and those who are more conservative. Now then, your next question was, well, doesn't that doom us to counterproductive opposition? And the first issue is, opposition is not necessarily counterproductive. Like if you want to hone the way you think, you need opposition. You need something pushing against you. But what has to happen, and this is rule 9, is you have to assume that the person that you're listening to, or that you're talking with, knows something you don't. And so we can engage in a dialogue between left and right. The right tends to stand for hierarchy and to value hierarchies as tools for obtaining necessary goals. And the left tends to view hierarchies as characterized by the proclivity to dispossess and to become tyrannical. Those are both correct. Through the dialogue, we can keep the hierarchies functional and also pay attention to the people who are at the bottom. That requires dialogue. It requires that opposition.
By the way, great question. I think that's such a great example of how, even though you may not think of yourself as a political participant, your participation in political conversation is really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Welcome back to this Next Revolution special with psychologist and best-selling author Dr. Jordan Peterson. So, when I got your book, Dr. Peterson, the first rule that I turned to was the one about parenting. Perhaps that's mainly because I'm a parent myself, but also because I think it's such an important issue for all the things we're discussing. Tell us about your rule on parenting and your thoughts on how children are raised, how they are raised, and perhaps how they should be raised.
Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Right.
Right. Well, it's a funny rule in a kind of harsh way again. The first part of it that's harsh is the frank admission that children can do things that make them dislikable.
Right.
Right, and that's something everyone knows, but no one wants to say. And the second part is that you as a parent, despite loving your children, might also not like them.
To strike any chords with the parents in the room?
So we're going to be frank about the situation. And so, well, so then the question then is, well, how do you deal with that? Because the truth of the matter is that if you are inclined upon occasion not to like your children, assuming that you're reasonably sane, and that's why it's useful to have a partner, because a partner can help keep you sane, right? The two of you, fragmented as you are, as individuals, might be able to come together and make one reasonable person. Right? And so that's the reasonable person that your child interacts with, and that person, a compound, is a proxy for the broader world. And so if your children are engaging in behavior that makes you dislike them, let's say after discussion with your partner, then the probability that other people will dislike them for that behavior is very high. And you might say, well, so what? It's not your job to produce a child that everyone likes. Well, maybe you wouldn't say that. And that's actually wrong. That is exactly your job. So especially what you want to do is that by the time your child is 4, and there's actually a fairly critical stage of development between 2 and 4, you want your child to be socialized well enough so that they're very good at playing with other kids. Because kids socialize each other from 4 onward. And so if your child has learned how to play, has learned how to share, has learned how to engage in reciprocal interactions, to take turns in all of that, to behave in a civilized manner, to be able to tolerate a little bit of failure, a little bit of deprivation as they wait their turn, and is enthusiastic and spontaneous and trusting in a kind of non-naive way and not too bossy, all of those things, then other children will line up to play with him or her. And it's in play that children learn how to adapt to the entire world. And so the kids who at 4 can't integrate themselves into the play world, get left farther and farther and farther behind, and they never catch up. So if your child isn't likable by other children, then you doom them to a life of comparative isolation. And then...
Sorry, can I just stop you there? Because that's, I think, the extension of this is what's so important, because, of course, it's nice if, children have the right kind of experiences and when they're children, but in a sense, why should we care? Well, the reason we should care is because this goes right the way through life, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
Could you just talk to that a little bit? Why these foundational things matter so much for the whole of the rest of someone's life?
Well, because children play games because they're practicing being human beings, adults even. They're practicing being adults. They make a little world in their pretend space, and then they act it out. And if they don't have an opportunity to engage in that, they never develop the sophisticated social skills, physical and cognitive, that enable them to do more and more and more and more complex things as they mature. And so you're definitely play lays the groundwork for successful adulthood. I mean, if you're working with people, partly what we're doing here insofar as this is going to go well is we're playing a little bit. We're playing along with the audience. We're playing talk show,
Yes.
There's a bit of a pretense about it, and hopefully we can do that in a way that's reciprocal, so that you have a good time and so that I have a good time and a meaningful time, and so the audience does as well. And that means that we've all learned how to play.
Yeah.
And we can create a space then that's mutually engaging and meaningful, where something that's useful can happen. And that's what you want for your children. And you also want them to react to adults properly. And that means they have to treat adults with a certain amount of respect, not least because they're going to spend most of their life being adults. And so if you don't teach children that adults are to be respected, you're devaluing their entire future, right? And you're not giving them any reason to grow up. And then most adults have a soft spot for kids. And so kids are cute, and they'll give them the benefit of the doubt. And so if your kid is cute and bouncy and playful and is open and reasonably respectful, then they'll see the best side of all the adults, and the adults will help them. And so then the whole world opens up to them. But if they're whiny and miserable and ungrateful and spoiled and selfish and cruel and deceitful and all of those things, then adults will smile at them falsely and shut them off. And everywhere they go, they'll be facing that.
And that's something that will, the consequences linger through life. I think we've got a question from our audience member, Adam.
Hey, how you doing? Love the show, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I was raised with very conservative values, and I'm finding that being here in New York City, there's just a lot of leftist stuff everywhere with victimhood and things of that nature. So I want to know how do you make it attractive for even smaller children to want to pick up those values of dignity and hard work?
Oh, well, one of the most effective ways to do that is to watch your children very, very carefully. And then when they do something that you regard as admirable in that vein, let them know and tell them exactly why. Like with a little kid, 2 or 3, not so verbal yet, that might be a pat, and you just say, look, good job, kid. Maybe they've managed to carry the cutlery to the table and, put it up top, and because they like to help. And so you can give them little tasks that are useful, and then that they're within their domain of competence, and then reward them. And not in a false way. Say, look, the table needed to be set. You brought a spoon and a fork over there, and you got it on the table. Good job. You're very helpful. And so what you want to do, and this is also what you want to do with your partner to some degree, is you want to watch your people very, very carefully. And then when they do something that you would like them to do more of, you tell them that they've done a good job, and you tell them why. Because one of the currencies that children run on is attention. They love attention. They'll do anything for attention. And so if you can give them attention when they do something you want, which requires real sharp vision, and you have to be consciously attempting to do this, then you can facilitate that movement into responsibility happily. They'll be thrilled to do it. I mean, you're going to have bumps with your kids, obviously, but there's nothing more powerful than focused, attentive, precise reward. And that isn't every child wins a trophy day. That's, you watch and you see when the child has done something that pushes them beyond their current limit. And you say, good work, kid, man. We could see a lot more of that. Way to be. And then they're all beaming away and thrilled about the situation. And that's a great thing to do.
Very good. Great advice. Thank you so much. Great question. We're here with psychologist and best-selling author Dr. Jordan Peterson. We've talked a lot about his book, 12 Rules for Life, but there are two initiatives he's focusing on as well: understanding myself and self-authoring. Let's hear more about those.
Well, we just talked a little bit about personality differences, and I have a website, understandmyself.com, that enables people to go. It takes about 15 minutes, and you can assess yourself on the canonical big 5 traits: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And then each of those is broken down.
So those traits are sort of well established.
They're very well established cross-culturally.
Right.
Yeah, and they were discovered statistically. They're not ideologically tainted. It's an atheoretical approach in some sense, and it's very useful because you need to know who you are, partly to know what your faults are going to be, you know, what you might need to work on. So, for example, if you're extroverted, it's very hard to spend any time by yourself, and if you're introverted, people wear you out. And if you're a disagreeable person, then you're blunt and harsh and rather judgmental, but very critically minded. And if you're compassionate, well, then people can take advantage of you. You know, so the site's very useful. It's very useful if you want to develop some understanding of the people around you, too. Like, I had my kids do it when they were teenagers, and I thought I knew my kids pretty well, but doing the personality test actually highlighted some things about them that I didn't understand that helped me deal with them better. And so that's Understand Myself. And the self-authoring program, it has 3 parts. It helps people write about their past, because you need to know where you are and what you're doing, and to write about their present, because you need to know who you are. But most importantly, I would say, to write a plan for your future. And people don't generally do that. And so this is a guided writing exercise that helps you decide if you were going to take care of yourself, like you were someone responsible for helping.
Yes,
that's rule 2.
Yeah.
What would you want 3 to 5 years down the road? If your family could be what you wanted it to be, what would that look like? Your career, your education, your constructive and meaningful use of time outside of work, your care for your own mental, physical health, your ability to withstand temptations like sexual behavior and drug and alcohol abuse. And you get to have what you want, but you have to specify it.
Right.
So you're asked to write about that for 15 minutes, and then to write a countervision. If you let your bad habits get out of control, what sort of little hell could you construct for yourself over a 5-year period? That gives you something to work towards.
It's so smart. You know, the thing that really I find so interesting, just listening to you and having read the book and seeing what you have to say, is that you're coming at things from your professional background that in the end were very similar things that I used to work on when I was working in government, trying to solve these big social policy problems, you know, how to make sure that kids are raised in a stable, loving home, how to give people a sense of direction so that they can, you know, do well at school and then train and get jobs so that we can have a good economy. So these public policy things, I was coming at from a policy point of view. But actually, I think what you're tapping into, and the reason you've had this an amazing response, is that going at it from a personal point of view is much more powerful.
I can tell
it's
you
much more powerful than government and politics and policy.
Well,
I see people nodding.
It's certainly a nice adjunct. So university students who complete the Future Authoring program are about 30% more likely to stay in school. And that's particularly true if they're non-Western ethnic minority students. It has a disproportionate impact on them. So that's that was very exciting for us, and it's a fairly straightforward intervention. And it's certainly, the interventions also, the literature indicates, not research we've done specifically, that writing out a life plan like that is very much likely to improve your health, because it makes you less stressed when you specify the future, and more hopeful because you have something to work for, and also more productive.
It's really powerful. We'll make sure that we'll put all the links and the information you need to follow up on that. Follow us at NextRevFNC and at Steve Hilton X.